Hello, U.S. history students, and welcome to the final lesson for this week on the early years of the Civil War. Okay, we're going to talk about two things. We're going to review the stuff on Antietam, and we're also going to talk about Robert E. Lee in this lesson. It's a very, very short lesson. Again, if you're on the hybrid plan, you do not have to do this lesson. We're going to do something different in class on Thursday and Friday, combining this lesson and the previous lesson. Also, if you're working on Canvas, there is a set of notes that goes along with this to help you keep track of the information and highlight some of the important points. So I highly recommend you fill those in as we go through. All right. So let's continue with the early years of the war. All right. Let's start off by talking about Robert E. Lee. And we're going to talk more about Lee when we get to the people of the war. We're going to talk about Lee and Jefferson Davis and Stonewall Jackson and Ulysses S. Grant, Abraham Lincoln, and William T. Sherman. We're going to talk more about these guys when we get into the war itself, okay? Or we'll get further into the war. Let's put it that way. All right, so let's start talking about Lee. Now, Lee is from Virginia. He was opposed to secession, okay, and thought that Virginia would not secede at all, okay? Unfortunately, when Lincoln called for those troops after the Battle of Fort Sumter, he did not think that the Union should be held together by force. Okay, and he objected to Lincoln's call for troops. So when Virginia eventually secedes, Lee will resign his position from the Union Army because he was in the Union Army. Lee will resign his position from the Union Army and offer his services to the Confederate government. Okay, he actually works his way up to being a general. Okay, when he first joined the Confederate Army, he was put in charge of, he was basically kind of made quartermaster, which means he's in charge of supplies, and was supposed to, because he was good at organization, he was supposed to make sure that the men in the field had the necessary food and uniforms and things like that, and was trying to allocate them correctly. He doesn't want that. He really misses active combat. The main Confederate general, Joseph Johnston, ends up getting wounded. Johnston and the Confederate President Jefferson Davis did not get along, and Davis used that as an opportunity to replace Joseph Johnston with Robert E. Lee. And Robert E. Lee will be in command of the Confederate forces in the East and eventually be made commander of all Confederate forces right before the war ends. Okay, so his specific title, he is commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. Okay, that is going to be the main Confederate force in the Eastern Theater. Now, Lee went beyond military textbooks, okay, which was a big advantage to the South early on in the war. In fact, the Southern leadership, in terms of the generals and things like that, was one of the Southern advantages at the beginning of the war. The Union generals, and we're going to talk about this in just a second, the Union generals were very, very hesitant to apply their troops. A lot of the Union generals were political appointees, which means they could screw up as many times as they wanted to and nothing would happen to them because of who they were, okay, the fact that the politicians wanted them there. Some of the Union generals had good ideas, had good plans, but they couldn't deviate from those plans when those plans began to go wrong. That was General Burnside's problem at the Battle of Fredericksburg, okay? So the fact that the Confederate generals often went beyond military textbooks and were very, very flexible was a pretty good advantage for the South early on, okay? Now, some of Lee's generalship is going to be seen at the Battle of Antietam. Okay. Remember, the Confederate forces were being pushed to invade the North and try to capture Washington, D.C., the Union capital. Well, Antietam is a creek that runs close by Sharpsburg. Sharpsburg is a town in Maryland. Okay. Actually, it's in southern Maryland. If you go straight up 81, the first Maryland exit off of 81 will take you into Sharpsburg and the Antietam battlefield. Okay. And during the war, Maryland is a border state, which means it has troops fighting for the South and fighting for the North. Lee had hoped that by going into Maryland, he would gain some supplies. He would take the war away from Virginia, which was continually being attacked. Of course, Virginia's in the crossroads. To get to Washington, you got to go through Virginia, and to protect Washington, you got to go through Virginia. So Virginia's kind of in the crossfire of actions against Washington, D.C. So Lee hopes if I go to Sharpsburg, if I go to Antietam, I can get some supplies. I can take the war out of Virginia. I will go into the north. I might put some pressure on Washington, D.C. because Sharpsburg is very, very close to Washington, D.C. And it'll be good, okay? Unfortunately, when Lee goes into Maryland, Maryland's a border state. Maryland didn't want to be invaded by anybody. So the support that he was hoping was going to show up doesn't materialize, okay? And the supplies that he hopes are going to show up doesn't materialize, okay? Antietam, as we talked about earlier, becomes the single bloodiest one-day battle of the American Civil War, okay? More on that in a second. Northern soldiers happened to find a cluster of cigars, okay, laying on the ground. They're pursuing Lee's army. Lee has moved off, and in the trash that's left behind, a group of soldiers finds this group of cigars. Well, they unravel the cigars, and there's this piece of paper wrapped around, and on that piece of paper, they discover Lee's war plan. The Union Army knows exactly where Lee is going. They know exactly how many troops he has, who's in charge, all that stuff, and they now can potentially get a heads up on him. Okay, they have so much information that they could possibly not only defeat him in battle but also win the war here. Okay, and the Union general is General McClellan. All right. This is going to lead to the Battle of Antietam, the single bloodiest day in American history, the single bloodiest day in the American Civil War. Actually, I take that back. It's probably not the single bloodiest day anymore. I think Pearl Harbor outranks that as well as some other things. But it is the single bloodiest one-day battle of the American Civil War. Okay, casualties are about 26,000. We talked about that at the last lesson. And it is a Union victory, okay? It is a Union, well, the Union is going to claim it as a victory, okay, because the South loses a fourth of its men and Lee retreats back across the Potomac into Virginia, okay? I told you before, and I'm going to maintain this, in reality, it is probably a draw, okay? The Union casualty numbers were actually a little bit more than the South, okay? The difference is the Union can replace those numbers, the South can't. Both sides in the battle in relatively the same position that they were in when they started, okay? But the fact that Lee retreats back into Virginia is enough for McClellan and Lincoln to claim this as a Union victory when in reality it's probably closer to a draw. The fact that it was not a clear-cut Union victory and the fact that McClellan basically wasted the information he had from those cigars is going to lead Lincoln to remove him from command. Okay, McClellan was one of those generals. He always thought Lee had superior numbers, which always made him hesitant to put in all of his troops, okay, to commit all of his troops to battle. There were several incidences. McClellan was in charge of 7 Days battle here in Virginia. There were a couple incidences there where he could have possibly won the war. He came close to Richmond a couple of times, and if he had just pushed a little bit further and pushed a little bit harder, he probably could have won and won the war. Antietam's another example. He's got the plans, he's got the troops, and he fails to use them. And even though Lee retreats, Lee is going to fight another day. Okay, McClellan could have successfully won the battle and probably won the war here at Antietam if he had pushed just a little bit harder. And Lincoln is eventually going to get tired of it. Lincoln jokingly asked McClellan if he could borrow the army a couple times and do something with it, because McClellan gets it all organized and ready to go and then just sits there and does nothing. Okay, so Lincoln eventually gets fed up and dismisses McClellan from command. All right. The Battle of Antietam, though, is going to lead to the Emancipation Proclamation, okay, which is what we're going to talk about probably next week as well. So we're going to leave off here and go into more detail with Antietam later on down the road in connection to the Emancipation Proclamation. We're also going to pick up with more Civil War people next week, and we're going to continue prosecuting this war through the years 1863, 1862, and 1865.